Hello again. This is Richard Lummis, and I'm here with Tom Fox for another episode of 12 O'Clock High. Usually a business podcast, but today we're continuing our presidential series with the Herbert Hoover Part 2, which is his presidency and then his post-presidential career as well. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you, Richard.
His election in 1928 was interesting. It was largely passive campaigning then. He did one stain on his record is that the Republican Party at the time was pursuing what they called the lily white strategy in the South, which consisted of removing the black Republicans from leadership positions in order to counteract the racist appeals of the Democratic Party at the time. His opponent was Al Smith, governor of New York State. It was a Catholic, was hurt very badly by an anti-Catholicism. And his opposition to prohibition. And this was the time the resurgence of the KKK, which people forget was anti-Catholic as well as anti-black. Anyway, it was Hoover trounced Smith, winning 58% of the popular vote and 444 of the then 531 electoral votes. But so he came in during the height of prosperity, and then his subsequent presidency during the worst economic downturn in history to date, I suppose. His policies and leadership style proved utterly inadequate for dealing with the unprecedented crisis. So, Don, why don't you tell us a bit about the onset?
Sure. So this first phrase, a chicken in every pot, a car in every garage, I thought that was a phrase from Huey Long. And I was very surprised to hear that this was actually campaign slogan of Herbert Hoover in 1924. So sounds like a lot of socialism to me. That's where we were. And I'd like our listeners to, we are going to, I think, be fairly critical of Hoover here, at the same time admiring him. He clearly made missteps, but think about where the country was when he came on board. Elected in 28, becomes president then on March 4th or March 15th of 29. Well, literally 6 months after that, we have October of 1929, and we have the largest crash of the stock market ever. There's no comparison in this in American history to this time frame. There was the dot-com bubble that happened after Bush 2 came in, but that completely paled beside this. And indeed, we didn't have an economic crisis of this level until 2020, when literally the United States and the world was shut down due to the coronavirus pandemic. And so this was a crisis of the greatest magnitude. But 6 months before, the confidence of Herbert Hoover, the confidence of the Republican Party, the confidence of indeed the U.S. nation was at an all-time high. Let the good times roll was a phrase about the economics of the 1920s and what had happened after World War I, when the United States was not largely untouched, it was completely untouched. And it was became the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, leading to what we're going to see after World War II. But it was money, 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 manufacture, 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 and buy. And the American people were doing all three. And Richard,
It was also grow, commerce, which led to the disaster of the agriculture.
And Richard and I did an interesting series on economic bubbles once. And we did not do the 20s, but we well could have, because all of the pieces were in place for a downturn, whether that you call that a technical correction, or you call that a market crash, you call it a Great Depression, whatever it may have been, but it was the biggest ever. So in 6 months, we go from one of the world's top economies to one of the world's not top economies. Now, the world was also going through this crash. So if you now, and I'd like you to now think about '08 and '09, the economic crash literally on a worldwide basis. I heard more than one non-US citizen say, we are hoping and expecting the United States to lead us out of this worldwide economic depression, is what we called it then, and or economic downturn. And we did largely as the country. But we couldn't do that in '29 because we were equally as broken as everybody else. We had unemployment rates over 25%. And as Richard just alluded to, grow, grow, grow. Well, that didn't happen after '29, and U.S. farming industry took the biggest shock it's ever taken. And I say all this generally is really, and I know Richard's going to highlight this even more, but the problems Hoover was facing and his team were facing were unprecedented. And the precedents that he tried to draw on were wholly inadequate to the situation. We're going to talk about the PR war that he lost as well. But Richard, the onset of the depression, the market crash, his initial response, maybe walk us through these. And can we see that Hoover really tried some things, or was he just completely overwhelmed even at the start?
Yeah, the extent of the crash is still kind of hard to grasp. The on one day, Black Thursday in October 1929, about three times as many shares traded as normal, and the market lost 11% of value in a day. The following Tuesday, even more shares were traded. The market continued to fall. Eventually, the stock market bottom wasn't actually until 1932, but at that point, it had lost 90% of its pre-crash value. So the financial sector, the banking sector were all extraordinarily damaged. The farm sector had a history of overproduction dating from World War One, when Europe was not producing any agricultural goods because all the young men were at war. So the overproduction, debt made the farm sector a disaster. Consumer goods were unsellable because wages were dropping, and factory owners were cutting production and firing staff, which reduced demand even further. Hoover actually had called for regulation of margin trading before the crash, but between margin calls and panic selling, the market lost another 23% in value on 2 days in late October. Farmers couldn't pay bills or mortgages, which made the rural banks fail since we didn't have any government backup at the time. The Dust Bowl and drought didn't actually start until the 30s, but they obviously made it much worse. 5,000 banks failed. Quarter of farms went into foreclosure, and 100,000 jobs were lost every week. And that Hoover, when he was Secretary of Commerce, had called for regulation of insider trading and margin trading, and he called on the Fed to raise interest rates. But he still stuck to his voluntary cooperation mode that had served him well for the previous part of his career. And maybe that's part of the problem, is that his toolkit had worked before, but when his toolkit utterly failed, he still kept trying to use the same tools. He said during late October, the crash, he said, the fundamental business of the country, which is production and distribution, is on a sound and prosperous basis, and called for voluntary cooperation to do what is sort of unclear. So the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, infamous Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of June 1930, certainly didn't help international trade. And the collapse of international markets that you referred to earlier was yet another blow to any hope of a recovery. So about this time, he started to be very, very much criticized and vilified for not doing anything. But as far as these shanty towns being called Hoovervilles and so forth, sort of personalizing the whole thing. But it eventually led to a great deal of social unrest, especially with the bonus armies and so forth, which I guess we should get into. But
So let me just echo what you said several times in both this podcast and our prior podcast, Richard, which was Hoover's belief in self-reliance and limited government intervention. And for him, I think calling for even cooperation between business and labor to stabilize the economy was a step further than he had ever gone, and probably was about as far as he was willing to go with. No, I have to withdraw that statement because he went several steps further. And that's where I'd like to talk about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation.
Okay.
This was a revolutionary development at the time, the RFC, and this was direct government funding in businesses. Now, it was a little bit different than what FDR came up with, and it's probably not as well remembered today as it should be. And I only have a more than abiding interest in this because my father talked about it a little. So when I got to college, I studied it a little bit, and he set up a fund for direct government intervention, and I was just too little. It wasn't too late. It just was too little. And there needed to be huge amounts of money pumped into the economy. And one of the things we learned, I hope, from the first Trump administration is you can avoid a catastrophic worldwide depression if you pump and pump and pump and pump money into an economy. That doesn't mean there are not going to be consequences from that. Inflation is inevitably going to raise its head. There's going to be political arguments about what's fair, what's not, who should get it, who shouldn't, who has to repay and who doesn't. But what Trump's Secretary of Treasury did in the Q2 and 3 and 4 of 2020 was literally open the full tap of the American government to pump money to individuals and companies through PPP loans, direct grants, and other tactics that helped pull the United States out of the 2020 downslide after the world literally had to shut down. So I'm not sure that's a lesson learned from Hoover, that economic theory has evolved from where he started, but he really, I think, should be given at least some credit for trying to do something. And then let's move to public works projects, because that's direct government intervention in the economy. And now he didn't think of this. It wasn't new. There's something called the Erie Canal that in song and dance is celebrated today, but was one of the greatest government construction projects in the 19th century, up until the railroads crossing the country. And so we have had major construction projects funded by the government that benefited large swaths of the American public. And Hoover Dam, in our prior episode, we talked about the water deal that Hoover helped negotiate with the Western states. Well, Hoover Dam was the centerpiece of this. And if you live in America, you owe it to yourself to go to Hoover. It is one of the most awe-inspiring things I have ever seen. And you can stand it, look up at it if your neck can crane that in that much direction. You can look down at the waters. You can go in to see the actual engineering they did in the 30s and 20, or I guess the 30s. It's still working today. And it is, you could drive across it, you could walk across it. And it really is as awe-inspiring an engineering marvel in the United States as I have ever seen, Richard.
Yeah.
So it still stands today and is working today. So some of the things he did have literally influenced now almost 100 years later. And I wanted to put those two out there. But one thing we haven't talked about, I think, Richard, that really starts to play in here, and it will probably play on anyone, including our effervescent personalities, is he became very, very prickly. And because he was criticized all the time. And you mentioned the Hoovervilles, and that was just one of them. But he was the person blamed. He didn't deserve it. but he was the face of the American government, for better or worse, because he was elected. And I'm not sure, short of a deity from parts unknown coming to Earth, they would have had a better reception with the American people. And the public backlash, I know that you're going to talk about that a little bit, but his very businesslike, analytical, geologically trained mind, I think, forced him into not a series of actions, but a series of ways to think through a problem that couldn't expand to what we say now, thinking outside the box. And then the personality part, I think, under the extraordinary pressure he was under, came through. So maybe you could talk about some of the more public events that, frankly, I find just horrible today, and I can't hardly imagine what they were like in the 30s.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we also forget that part of it, he kept thinking that the worst had passed because it was without precedent, the continued deterioration of the economy. Normally, we'd had, bad panics before in the 19th century, but they had all been relatively brief. And so I think the lack of imagination of how bad this could get hurt him. And then we're so used to a government social safety net being in place that it's hard to imagine a time when it didn't exist basically at all. It led to a lot of the problems, and including the shanty towns. But the most public thing was the bonus army. And a little background there, there was a bonus bill passed in 1931, which passed over Hoover's veto. And what had happened was that Congress had purchased life insurance policies for all the veterans of World War One in 1924. Well, all the veterans actually, and the scheduled maturity was in 1945. So the bonus bill would have allowed them to borrow up to half the value of the life insurance policy. In 1930, July 1932, the bonus army of veterans marched on Washington to try and get 100% payable, basically, 13 years up front. And although Hoover quietly provided food and shelter, he rejected the demands. And Congress also rejected the demands, and most of them left. But some stayed on in abandoned buildings and in tents. And Hoover instructed the military, well, the police attempted to disperse them and ended up killing a couple of them when they were overwhelmed and basically opened fire to defend themselves. And then so Hoover called in the military and ordered them to peacefully remove the protesters. But he gave the job to General Douglas MacArthur, who regarded the protesters as communists, and he attacked them, their camps, with tanks and tear gas and burned the tent camps. And although Hoover hadn't ordered any of that, he stepped up and took responsibility for it rather than roasting MacArthur, which he should have done anyway. But so anyway, his reputation has never recovered from that. Sicking the military on unarmed protesters was a disaster.
Richard, as I recall, the bonus marchers, the bonus had been part of the compensation that was offered at the time of enlistment or shortly thereafter. And then the change was made in that you referenced in 31. Did I have that right, or was this bonus? Okay,
That's correct.
So this is something that literally, every man, and it was men in 16, 17, and 18 signed up. And so it was something that was very well supported by the American people. And even though, as you kind of went through it all, Richard, most of them had left. The Congress had turned down their requests. The DC police had tried to remove them. And as a last resort, I think Hoover instructed MacArthur to remove them. The portrait of the American government in the form of the U.S. Army removing men who had served our country in wartime in a forceful manner with a few deaths could not have been, or you could not have had a much worse public presentation by our government. And um, it was just horrific, and it continues to be horrific. I still find the horror of it today. Do you think that as Hoover thought through this as a process in some of the steps that you articulated, you know, they came, they asked, they didn't get it, they dispersed, few stayed, they very publicly camped out and used vacant buildings, that this was moving to an inevitable confrontation because of the way Hoover would think through a problem, or is something different?
Well, I think the sheer desperation of the veterans made such a confrontation basically inevitable once their demands were not met. They saw no way out. And that's a bad place to put anybody, because then you end up with results like this. So,
Richard, in the introduction, or at least your opening remarks of our first pod on Herbert Hoover, you mentioned that he was the longest living ex-president until Jimmy Carter, who we lost on December 31 of 2024. What did Hoover do as ex-president, and did he put together sort of a framework or lessons that can be utilized by a new ex-president, since we happen to have one of those today as we're recording, or former president, I should say?
he publicly objected to most of the policies of FDR throughout FDR's term in office. And, he was sort of, his anti-communism was quite striking. He objected to forming an alliance with Stalin after the Nazis abrogated the Russian-German alliance and invaded Russia. He thought supporting Stalin was a moral obscenity, which of course is still an arguable position. But in any event, he opposed U.S. involvement in World War II, including the Lend-Lease Act, and was active in the isolationist movement. He again took up the role of organizing relief for the citizens in Poland and Belgium and Finland. He was a confidant of Truman, despite having a lot of political differences with him. And he opposed the use of the atomic bomb and the Korean War, for instance. But Truman appointed him to the Hoover Commission in 1947, which recognized that the burdens of the modern presidency were such that it needed reform of the bureaucratic and administrative state to strengthen the executive branch, which of course has continued today. His wife died in 1944, and he outlived her by about 20 years before dying of colon cancer in 1964 at the age of 90. But so he had an he remained active in politics, I guess. There had previously been sort of a tradition of withdrawing from politics once you left the presidency. He didn't do that. He remained a public figure. But anyways, kind of had a very active post-presidency.
Or Richard, I'd like to maybe tie back with the questions I posed at the start of episode 1 of our two-part exploration of Herbert Hoover, because we showed, I hope, in episode 1, just the resume of this man. And as you said, he had succeeded in everything he did up until the time he became president. Is there anything that we could learn from this as citizens about how to evaluate particular candidates or particular individuals who might run? Or is it, as Jim Baker said, we elect them and see if they can do it?
Well, I'm beginning to come around to Baker's point of view, because the job is utterly unique. There's so many aspects to it. His attempts to use public works and in order to counteract the effects of the Great Depression were well-intentioned. They were just simply, I don't think he could get his head around the government assuming the levels of debt that would have been required in order to put even a dent in unemployment. And maybe there wouldn't have been there was, even at the time, there were objections that a lot of the projects would make were, which continued into FDR's term, of course. But yeah, I think it was a failure of imagination on his part. But certainly, you certainly would have thought that Hoover would have been a successful president, and you certainly would have thought Taft would have been a better president than he ended up being. As you pointed out, the most impressive resume doesn't necessarily prepare you for the absolute unique demands of the job.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're going to have another one-term president down the road who had a great resume, George Bush the first, and we'll see if he had a second term or not. Well, Richard, this has really been an interesting retrospective. I knew a lot of the Hoover presidency. I was not as aware of his pre-political work, but I think I have to agree that he was just overwhelmed by the scope of the problem. And you touched on at the end something we did not touch on throughout the series, which was the economic aspect and debt. He did not believe, understand, or even have a grasp of using that much debt to try to jumpstart the economy. Keynes, I don't think he'd read Keynes. And if he had, he disagreed with him vibrantly. And
Let's be honest, I haven't read Keynes either.
But you know who he is.
I know a general summary of his thoughts, but I certainly haven't read it.
But you've never been president either, so there you go.
Well,
So a lot to learn, a lot to discover, a lot to maybe take in, and I hope we have posed some questions that our listeners will consider in how they evaluate any candidate for leadership as well. So we're going to have several episodes of the next president, who of course is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. So I hope you will join us for those episodes as well. Richard, you want to take us home?
yeah. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoy 12 O'Clock High, and you'll come back for not just our presidential biography series, but for our business thoughts as well. Signing off from 12 O'Clock High, it's Richard Lummis and Tom Fox.